We are pleased once again to have Scott Weidensaul as our speaker. As Scott spoke to our group during at March of 2022, and his program was entitled then "A World on the Wing: The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds," which expanded on his book "Living on the Wind Across the Hemisphere with Migratory Birds." That was the book that was in 2000 was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in the general natural history category. Scott is an author, researcher, educator, public speaker, and bird tour leader. But above all, he is an ambassador and advocate for nature, particularly for birds. He's a fellow of the American Ornithological Society. He is also directs programs at Hog Island Center, which is an Audubon center on the coast of Maine. Scott's interest in birds began as a 12-year-old when his parents took him on a visit to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, where later as an adult, he became chairman of the board. As luck would have it, that fall day was wonderful for migrating birds, including red-tailed hawks, sharp-shinned hawks, and golden eagles. And Scott has been hooked on birds ever since. He has lived much of his life in the Appalachians of eastern Pennsylvania and now lives with his wife, Amy, in New Hampshire. His deep love of the Appalachians has been expressed in his book, Mountains of the Heart, A Natural History of the Appalachians, one of the more than 20 books he has written. And among those, 30 books, I should say, and among those 30 is this one. This is one of your books, Scott, one of 30, over 30 that you've written, A World on the Wing, The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds. The LA Times Book Review has written, quote, Scott Weidensaul ranks among an elite group of writer naturalists. Bruce Chatwin, John McPhee, and David Quammen come to mind, whose straightforward eloquence elevates ecology to the level of philosophy, unquote. In addition to your many books, Scott has been a nature columnist for the newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Scott has also written many writings for publications like the Smithsonian, New York Times, Nature Conservation, National Wildlife, and Audubon. Among Scott's research efforts have been directing a major effort to study the movement of northern saw-whet owls for more than 25 years. He's also part of a continental effort to understand the rapid evolution of a new migratory route and wintering range in the east by several species of western hummingbirds. Tonight, Scott will be speaking about Project SNOWstorm, which he co-founded and which uses cutting-edge technology to study snowy owls. Scott, we are honored to have you as our speaker tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, pleasure to be back at DFO. Congratulations on the 90th anniversary. That's terrific. I'm really honored to be part of the 90th anniversary year. And this is a perfect time to be talking about snowy owls because in about the last 2 weeks, a wave of snowy owls has come pouring across the Canadian border into southern Canada and the northern United States, and it looks like it's going to be a really good snowy owl winter. No guarantees if any of them are going to make it to Colorado, but we can keep our fingers crossed. As Bill said, I got hooked on raptors at a really early age and spent many years banding primarily diurnal raptors like the Swainson's hawk with my friend Bill Clark down in southern Texas a few years ago. And for a long time, though, if you'd asked me what my favorite bird was, it would have been the northern saw-whet owl. We're just wrapping up our 29th year of northern saw-whet owl research at the 3 banding stations that I oversee in the mountains of Pennsylvania. And I mean, come on, how can you not love that face? I mean, just look at that. But then a few years ago, I strayed. I wandered a little bit because my God, look at that bird. There is just something charismatic and sexy about a snowy owl. And how I got into snowy owl research is really it was really almost by accident. This is an eBird map of kind of a typical winter's distribution of snowy owls. This is January of 2013, and kind of the winter, sort of winter that is shaping up to this year. You know, a decent number of snowy owls up and down the New England coast, along the St. Lawrence and Ottawa River valleys in southern Ontario and Quebec. Quite a few of them around the Great Lakes. This is what it looked like in December of 2013. This was not a normal year. This was the biggest invasion of snowy owls into the east since at least the winter of 1926, 1927, and possibly as far back as the 1890s. And when this happened, when this wall of snowy owls came flooding down out of the eastern and central Canadian Arctic and into basically everywhere from the northeastern coast to the Great Lakes and parts of the Great Plains, you heard kind of the same story whenever you opened up the newspaper or turned on the television. And the story was that these were starving snowy owls that had been driven south by hunger from the Arctic, where their prey populations had collapsed. And these owls were doomed to wander these southern landscapes until they basically all died. And essentially nothing about that story is accurate. It was not privation that drove these owls south. It was actually the result of an extraordinary degree of plenty in the subarctic, actually, because what happened that previous summer, the summer of 2013, in the northern Ungava Peninsula, up at the northern tip of Quebec, lemming populations and vole populations reached historic peaks. What you see there is a snowy owl nest in the Ungava Peninsula that summer with, and feel free to count, 78 dead lemmings and voles gathered around 5 eggs and one hatched chick. This is one enthusiastic male snowy owl. But what had happened was, small mammal populations in the Arctic and the subarctic are cyclical. They rise and fall, often in about a 4-year cycle. And that year, it was just a bumper crop of small mammals in that part of the Ungava. And we don't know how snowy owls do this, but somehow they figure out where these local population booms are occurring. And they often will gather there in large numbers and just start producing babies. In an off year, when there's not a lot of food, a snowy owl female may only lay 2 or 3 eggs and may not be able to raise all those chicks if there's not enough food. That year, there were as many as 9 or anywhere from 9 to 11 eggs in some of those snowy owl nests. And there was enough food, as you can tell, to feed all of those chicks. And so you had this historic, epic breeding event. And those of us down in the South knew absolutely nothing about this. This was happening in a part of the world where there are relatively few people, and the folks that do live there are mostly indigenous communities that have better things to do than alert people down to the South that there's a lot of snowy owls hanging around breeding. So nobody in southern Canada or the northern United States had a clue that this was happening until about Thanksgiving in November of 2013, when snowy owls began showing up in enormous numbers, as many as 300 snowy owls at Cape Race at the southeastern tip of Newfoundland, for example. And when those birds started moving into the United States, I got a call from this guy. This is Dave Brinker, who is a biologist with Maryland's Department of Natural Resources, the founder of Project Owlnet, somebody that I've been working with for many years mostly on saw-whet owl research. But Dave's a raptor bander. He got his start as a cheesehead in Wisconsin many years ago, occasionally banding snowy owls. And Dave called me and said, "Listen, none of us are going to live long enough to see something like this happen again. We need to try to get as much information from these snowy owls as we possibly can." And so our thought was, we would just try to mobilize as many raptor banders as we could to get out there and band as many snowy owls as they could, because there've never been that many snowy owls banded in North America in years past. Well, within a matter of a couple of days, it became clear that this phenomenon was this historic event was something that was going to eclipse anything that we were expecting. So we quickly gathered people like Norman Smith from Massachusetts Audubon, who's been studying snowy owls at Logan Airport in Boston since 1981. Really the first person in North America to start putting satellite transmitters on snowy owls to see where they're going. People like J.F. Therian at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, who did his PhD on snowy owls in the Arctic. And we gathered these folks together and said, how can we use the new technologies that are emerging to learn more about the winter ecology of snowy owls, what these birds do when they come south? Because there's been this long-standing myth, as I mentioned, that these snowy owls are a bunch of dead enders. If they come south, they're going to be starving, they're going to be wandering around the landscape. Actually, these birds are coming south in really good condition. They're fat, they're plump. These are mostly juveniles that were just born that summer. And but yet we know relatively little. We knew relatively little about what they do, how they live their lives, what their movements are like when they come south and share the landscape with us. And so we collaborated with this fellow. His name is Mike Lanzone. He was a founder of a company called Cellular Tracking Technologies. At the time, they were based in Pennsylvania. They now are down at Cape May in New Jersey. And Mike and his wife Tricia are golden eagle biologists. And Mike created cellular tracking technologies to build transmitters to follow snowy owls, or excuse me, to follow golden eagles. But Mike got his start as a teenager working up on the shores of Lake Ontario in Rochester, New York, with a guy named Tom McDonald, who was a snowy owl bander. And when Mike realized what was going on, one of his employees, who's a former research tech of mine, called me up and said, "Hey, listen, we've got a bunch of transmitters here that we built for somebody else, but if you can just cover our costs, we would love to get these on snowy owls." Which was great, except for two things. First of all, we can't just decide to go put transmitters on snowy owls. You need permission to do that. So we needed to come up with a proposal and submit it to the Federal Bird Banding Lab, asking permission to deploy GPS GSM transmitters on snowy owls to study their winter movements and understand their winter ecology. We also didn't have, well, we'll get into this later. We also didn't have a budget. Um, but we drew this proposal together. We sent it off to the bird banding lab. Do not let anybody tell you the government cannot work efficiently. They approved it in less than an hour because it turns out the banding lab was already aware of what was happening with the snowy owls, and they were anxious for somebody to do just this kind of study. And so Project SNOWstorm was born. And I should say that that capital SNOW, that's the four-letter bird banding code for snowy owl. SN from snowy, OW from owl. It's not just an affectation. So Project SNOWstorm was born. It's now a team of about 20 people. I'll show you a list of who those folks are in a minute. And in the years since then, we've got two main elements to Project SNOWstorm. And the sexy one that most people are aware of is the tracking with the GPS GSM transmitters. As of last winter, we've tagged 115 snowy owls in 17 states and provinces, working with volunteer banders in the US and Canada. We've now amassed what is probably the largest movement data set in the world for snowy owls. We're unaware of anybody else who has as large a data set for as many snowy owls as we do. But if we're going to the trouble of catching these birds, we also want to get as much information from them as possible. So we also collect blood and feather and DNA samples so that we can look at the stable isotopes in their tissues and their feathers, which can give us a sense of where they're coming from. We can look at the genetic structure of North America's snowy owl population. And we can also study those samples to look at the toxicology analysis, look at what kind of environmental contaminants these birds are picking up. And as you'll hear a little bit later, we've got some concerns about that. These birds are moving through a fairly polluted landscape, unfortunately, and that's having an impact on them. We've also organized a group of wildlife veterinarians that have been working with us as volunteers from the beginning. And I should say everybody involved with Project SNOWstorm is a volunteer. Nobody gets any kind of a stipend or a salary for doing this. This is something that folks do either as a part of their job or just for the love of it. And our veterinary team has been working over the years with federal and state agencies to salvage as many snowy owls that have been accidentally killed by planes or cars or flew into windows or electrocuted. I mean, there's a whole host of ways that snowy owls can come to a bad end when they come south with us. And that has allowed us to create the largest data set in the world on snowy owl health and toxicology. At this point, something like in excess of 400 snowy owls that our team has necropsied along with collaborators in the US and Canada. These are the core team members. I don't expect you to read all those names. Just understand that everybody on that list, as I said before, is a volunteer. Nobody in Project Snowstorm gets any kind of a salary. Everybody is doing this for the love of these birds. Now, as I said, the one thing that we did not have when we launched Project Snowstorm was a budget. Usually when you launch a major research project, there's a process where you draw up proposals and you send them to agencies or you send them to foundations and they get rejected and then you refine the proposals and you send them to somebody else and eventually you get enough money that you can launch this project. We jumped into this basically, we just walked off the ledge and jumped. We had a little bit of funding from some private donors in the beginning. Basically, CTT, Cellular Tracking Technology, said, listen, if you can just cover the cost, our manufacturing cost for these transmitters, which at the time was about $3,000 a unit, we'll give them to you at cost. But we didn't have $3,000 a piece to buy these high-tech GPS, GSM transmitters. So we went to a couple of folks that we knew who had been generous for some of our sawwood owl work in the past. And they very generously covered the cost of about 6 of these transmitters. And then Dave Brinker said, why don't we try crowdfunding? And I said, wait a minute. So you're saying what we should do is ask the general public to give us money to play with owls, because that's what it's going to sound like to people. I said, yeah, we should try to do that. I will confess, I thought this was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard, but we decided to give it a shot. And so we set what we thought was a very modest 20,000, well, excuse me, what I thought was a very ambitious $20,000 goal on the crowdfunding platform Indiegogo. Well, as you can see, by the end of that first season, we had raised more than $36,000 in small donations from almost 400 donors around the world and received an almost equal amount in sponsorships from organizations like the Natural History Foundation for Wisconsin, the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology, the Delmarva Ornithological Association, to sponsor us deploying transmitters on snowy owls in their states or their regions. And so that first winter, we were able to deploy transmitters on 22 snowy owls in about 8 states. We've refined those transmitters quite a bit over the years. This is an example of the style that we're using now. These transmitters weigh about 30 grams. They don't weigh all that much. They're solar powered. They operate using 2 technologies that most of you have in your pocket right now. They communicate with the GPS satellite system overhead, and as frequently as every 6 seconds, they record latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed, store that up in the onboard memory banks, and then 3 times a week, they dial up through the GSM cell network, and they send us all of those data cellularly. I like to joke that my friends are cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. And the data that they send us are incredible. Now, of course, you have to catch a snowy owl first, and that can be challenging. Snowy owls are not dumb, especially the adults, and we do prefer to put these transmitters on adults because they have a proven track record. These are birds that, in all likelihood, are going to survive to a next year. The transmitters these days only cost us about $1,000. Like everything else in technology, the price has come down. They've become much lighter and cheaper. But nevertheless, we don't want to waste a $1,000 transmitter for the most part on a juvenile owl. Once we've got the bird in hand, we put a USGS band on the bird's leg. We take a series of measurements. This is not a reflection on snowy owls, but I will tell you that snowy owls are quite literally lousy, or I should say lousy. They have more feather mites than almost any other bird I've ever handled in a lifetime of handling large raptors. I'm not sure that they necessarily have more, but these lice are just much more visible. Fortunately, they eat feathers. They don't care about people. We don't have to worry about getting them. I don't have to get deloused after I've been handling a snowy owl. The transmitters fit on a backpack. They weigh less than 3% of the bird's body weight. They're solar powered. I have to admit, we had a pretty steep learning curve when we started this project because we thought, okay, we know as snowy owl researchers that snowy owls are not, as a lot of people think, primarily diurnal. In the wintertime, they're mostly active at night, but they do roost out in the open. So we thought perfect application for a solar powered transmitter. What we didn't realize until we put some of these transmitters out is that snowy owls are like little sunflowers. They face the sun, and as the sun moves across the sky, they move with it, which means their back is always in shadow. So we had some difficulties in the early years coming up with solar panels that were strong enough in that short days of winter and low solar angle that there would be enough solar recharge to keep these things going. But with time and with advances in the technology, we've managed to overcome those. Um, these transmitters are generating really precise data, and I think it's fair to say that every single snowy owl that we have put one of these transmitters on has surprised us in some fashion, including the very first one, which was a juvenile male that we caught. And that first winter, I should say, almost virtually every snowy owl we put a transmitter on that first winter was a juvenile, because that's what almost every bird that came south was during that massive eruption year. This was a juvenile male that we tagged on Assateague Island in Maryland. He didn't stay at Assateague Island. He eventually moved over to the bay side of the Delmarva Peninsula in New Jersey, north of Cape May. And as you can see from this picture of his map, he spent relatively little time on land. This bird spent most of his time after dark, when he was actively hunting, out over the open waters of the Delaware Bay, hunting water birds. I think folks have this notion that snowy owls are mostly mammal eaters, and many of them are. Um, there are some snowy owls that winter inland, and they feed on nothing but small mammals or rabbits and things like that, or muskrats. But many of them winter along the coast, feed on water birds, and Assateague was one of these birds. Um, there were more than a few times where the data that we were getting caused us to scratch our heads. And this is another map of Assateague's movements. And everything that you see on this map in blue is after dark. Everything you see in red is in the daytime. You can see that this bird really didn't move very much during the daytime. It was content to sit, did most of its hunting at night. But out in the middle of Barnegat Bay, there was one spot where this bird kept landing during the night. Now, later in the winter, that bay pretty much completely froze. It was an extraordinarily cold winter, but this was still open water at this time of the year, and these birds don't float. And it wasn't until we really zoomed in that we realized that underneath all those little points, there was a buoy. There was a channel marker. And so this bird was flying out there at night and landing on this channel marker and going, okay, so let's see. Last night I had scaup. I think maybe tonight I'll have a bufflehead. And we were able to confirm that, because we knew where he was roosting in the daytime, and a couple of times folks were able to go in there and collect pellets. And yes, he was eating an awful lot of waterfowl. We got to know these birds as individuals, and that was one of the really cool things about Project Snowstorm. Anytime you're able to put a transmitter on a bird, as one of my colleagues at Snowstorm says, the lives of individual birds are fascinating. This is a young male snowy owl that was caught that first winter at a small municipal airport outside of Baltimore. And we didn't have a transmitter that was small enough to put on a male snowy owls, like most raptors, are smaller than the females. So we banded him and we moved him far inland and released him in the farmland of Western Maryland. The next winter, he came back to Maryland. He was caught, shifted around. This is a track this bird took up into Delaware, looped around to Lancaster County, and then back down to Cape May. Um, some of these birds wandered long distances, some of them barely moved. These are two adult females on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that spent the entire winter in adjacent territories. Each of those territories is about a quarter of a mile wide. And what you see here is that these birds essentially never trespassed on the other bird. The red bird only flew through the yellowbird's territory after the yellowbird had already moved north for the spring. But if your neighbor weighs about 6 pounds and has 8 needle-sharp talons at the end of her feet and is not afraid to use them, maybe you don't trespass. Um, Forgive me, I was getting my owls muddled before. The young male that was caught at the airport in Baltimore was this one. This is the bird that we nicknamed Baltimore. As I said, he was caught the first year at the small airport and was moved inland. Came back the next year, um, considerably whiter. You see, he's as is often the case with snowy owls, had whitened as he gotten older. That second year, we did have a transmitter that was the right size for him. We moved him to the coast and released him. He moved up into New Jersey, spent part of the winter up on around Great Egg and Egg Harbor on the Maryland coast. He was more of a surf and turf guy. Baltimore, and we tend to name these birds either for their capture location or their release location. This bird's transmitter was sponsored by the Baltimore Bird Club, so we named him Baltimore. He would hunt for water birds sometimes at night. He would hunt for mammals over land sometimes. Um, you can see he was moving back and forth across these salt marshes, spending a lot of time away from the beaches. That part of the New Jersey beach, there's a lot of beach vehicle access, and Baltimore had no use for that. And then as spring came on, he began to move north and he flew through New York City. And I mean, he flew through New York City, right through the middle of Manhattan at 2 o'clock in the morning, actually landed on top of this 58-story skyscraper next to Madison Square Garden. This was the view he had from up there, and then proceeded to head on north up into Canada for the rest of the summer. So Project Snowstorm, in the years that we've been out there, we have maintained essentially the same structure that we had that first winter. We have this core group of people that get together every winter, and some of them are banders that are out in the field doing the trapping and the tagging. Some of them are research scientists that are doing the data analysis. We've got the folks at CTT that keep coming up with um, uh, new advances in technology that make it possible for us to have ever smaller, ever lighter, ever more efficient um, transmitters that have more and more bells and whistles like accelerometers and temperature sensors. Um, and we continue to fund the entire thing through an annual crowdfunding campaign. It's everything that we get, all the money that we raise is through an organization called the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in Eastern Pennsylvania, which has been the institutional home of Project Snowstorm from the beginning. So all the donations to Project Snowstorm are tax deductible for U.S. citizens, although we have many Canadians who, even though they don't get a tax write-off, are longtime supporters of us as well. I'm kind of the public face of Project Snowstorm. I write regular blog posts through the winter, and all of the tracking data from all of the snowy owls that we have tagged over the years is available on the Project Snowstorm website. Whether these are birds that we have tracked in the past that we're no longer in communication with, or birds, like, for example, we're hoping to deploy an additional 8 transmitters this fall. The one thing we won't tell you is where the owl is right now. All of our interactive tracking maps are time delayed by at least 24 hours because we don't want you to be able to find the owl in real time. We want to give these owls as much space as possible. And if there is an owl in an area that we feel is getting an unwarranted amount of attention from birders and photographers, particularly if they are unethical photographers who are trying to bait the owls, we will take that tracking data down and we'll mask that bird's location. We are very sensitive to the welfare of these birds. The last thing we want to do is anything that puts them at risk. And the tracking data will show you where these birds are in the past. And one of the things that we have found with these birds is that they are highly nomadic in summer. Many of them, especially adults, will return year after year after year to almost exactly the same place in the winter, but they can wander as much as several thousand miles from one breeding season to the next. For example, this is an adult male named Otter that we tagged in 2019 in upstate New York. Otter has been all over the place. Some years he is up in the Ungava Peninsula of northern Quebec. Some years he's on Baffin Island. Some years he's up in the central Canadian Arctic near the Boothia Peninsula. Otter is one of the few birds we have that has a hybrid transmitter that communicates with the cell phone network, but also with the Argo satellite network overhead. And actually, at the moment, his GSM cellular transmitter is old enough now. It's a 3G transmitter. It no longer communicates with the new 5G and LTE cell towers that have replaced all of the 2G and 3G transmitters out there. That's been one of the difficulties of working with cellular technology, is that the telecoms keep moving ahead and obsoleting some of these older transmitters. But fortunately, the Argo side of it, the Argo satellite side, still works. And so, for example, we know that last winter, Otter wintered on Baffin Island. The last 2 years, he stayed up in the Arctic and the subarctic over the winter. And this past summer, he was kind of wandering around Baffin Island. No sign that he was actively breeding last year up there. So we continue to be in touch with him. If he ever comes back south again and we can retrap him and take that old transmitter off and replace it with a new one, we'd love to do that, because all of the GSM data, all this really highly detailed GSM data that has presumably still stored in that transmitter. If we get our hands on it and we could download it, that would be an absolute treasure trove. But you can zoom in on these maps. What you're seeing here in this particular map, and unfortunately, this style of map at CTT is going to be going away. This is running off a legacy server that they're paying about $1,500 a month, basically just for our benefit. And they're going to be moving to a new and I have to say pretty slick new mapping technology. But everything that you see there in black is at night. Anything in yellow is in the daytime. Anything in gray is twilight. And here you can see pretty clearly that these birds, even though they have a reputation for being diurnal, are doing most of their movements at night. In the wintertime, snowy owls, like any owls, are mostly nocturnal. You can click on these things. You can see if the bird in this case was moving, it was moving at about 28 knots as it was starting to move north in March on its way back to the Arctic breeding grounds. Every once in a while, we'll get something, as I said before, that makes us scratch our head. This is a map from that very first winter in 2013, 2014. This was a bird out on Lake Erie that was banded and tagged in Erie, Pennsylvania. And this is the way we download our data from the transmitters. It comes in as a KML file in Google Earth, and everything you see there that is a square icon is a stationary point. Anything that's a triangle is a point where the bird, an icon where the bird was in motion. That winter, the Lake Erie was about 98.5% frozen, and these little square icons represented an owl that was moving at about a quarter of a mile an hour. And I have to say, when I first saw this, I thought, oh my God, he's walking to Canada. Because and it actually took a couple of days, and some of us, kind of scratching our head before the penny dropped, and we realized that no, this is what happens when you have an owl that is sitting on massive slab of ice that is being very, very slowly pushed by prevailing winds to the north and east at about a quarter of a mile an hour. So yes, the lake was 98.5% frozen, it was 1.5% open, and you had these big sort of interlocking blocks of ice. And these owls, this owl and another juvenile male, spent about 6 weeks out in the middle of Lake Erie. And we had to wonder at times, like, what on earth are they eating out there? But again, when we looked at satellite pictures of the lake, we realized that as the wind blew, if the prevailing winds were coming from the north, it would push the ice away from the north shore of the lake. If it was coming from the south, it would push the ice away from the south shore of the lake. It would break these slabs. There'd be openings, and in those openings, there were water birds. There were gulls and ducks and grebes and loons. And that's what these birds were feeding on. In a way, what we realized these young birds were doing on the frozen Great Lakes was, in a sense, practicing for a lifestyle that some adult snowy owls pursue in the Arctic, which is that they remain in the Arctic, out on the Arctic sea ice through the depths of the Arctic winter, when for months at a time the sun does not rise, but where you have these permanent openings in the ice called polynyas that are maintained by upwellings and currents. And we now know that in those polynyas, in the middle of the Arctic winter, you have sea ducks like eiders, you have alcids like thick-billed and common murres, and in some cases dovekies, and snowy owls that are hunting there in the middle of this dark, windswept 50, 60 below zero landscape. And as I said, in some cases in the winters, some of these young birds are practicing that down on the Great Lakes. We had birds that were wintering out in the middle of the Great Lakes, and we had birds that were wintering in the heart of urban areas. This is a bird that was also trapped at that same small airport outside of Baltimore and fitted with a transmitter and moved to Western Maryland. And she flew right back to the heart of Baltimore and spent the winter in the heart of Baltimore, down on the inner harbor. It was actually kind of cool to be able to go into Google Street View and see, like, for example, the snowy owl loved to roost on the roof of this church in downtown Baltimore. I had to wonder what she was eating, how many pigeons or perhaps poisoned rats she was eating. I would not have wanted to be a free-running cat in that neighborhood, because snowy owls will eat anything they can arm wrestle down their throat at that time of the year. But the thing is, snowy owls can get themselves in trouble when they come south. Um, I mentioned Norman Smith earlier. Norman's been studying snowy owls at Logan Airport for years, and that first winter, um, I think probably about 10 of the snowy owls that we tagged were snowy owls that Norman had trapped at Logan Airport, fitted with one of our transmitters, and then moved either north to places like Parker River National Wildlife Refuge up at Plum Island, or south to um, empty beaches down on Cape Cod. This is a bird that he named Plum, that he had moved down to Cape Cod, and she actually moved out from Cape Cod out to Martha's Vineyard, rather tony place to spend the winter, I have to say. And she did quite well out there up until about the third week of March, when a huge nor'easter came blowing up the Atlantic coast with hurricane force winds and absolutely enormous waves. And just before daybreak, this young owl tried to fly across the open water of the bay, and she didn't make it. We don't know if the wind pushed her down into the water or if a wave caught her, but she was swamped and drowned and eventually washed up on the beach. I would tend to think an older, more experienced owl would not have made that mistake. She was one of two owls, tagged owls, that we lost in that same storm. Another one was up in Gloucester Harbor, farther north in Massachusetts. And we knew of at least half a dozen other unbanded, untagged young snowy owls that also drowned in that storm. Nature is harsh on young birds, but people are harder. And one of the most dangerous places for a snowy owl is one of the places that they are drawn to, which are airports and airfields. Snowy owls, we've known for a long time, are drawn to airfields, and we think the reason for that is because, especially in urban environments, airports are often the only open, treeless places around, and from a snowy owl's perspective, they probably look a little bit like the Arctic. I mean, this is a bird to whom airplanes and trees are equally alien and equally new. And so they're no more afraid of airplanes than they are of trees. Unfortunately, airplanes are a lot more dangerous to snowy owls than trees are. And in fact, I found that out the hard way. The very first snowy owl, that first winter in 2013, that I put a transmitter on was this juvenile male snowy owl that I trapped with the help of Jenny Martin there from the USDA Wildlife Services. She's the person at the airport that tries to keep birds away from airplanes and vice versa. So we trapped this young male. We nicknamed him Philly. We put a transmitter on him. With the help of the Pennsylvania Game Commission, we transported him about 50 miles west into the heart of Amish country in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is a great place for snowy owls. There were snowy owls all over the place in Lancaster County that winter, and the little bugger didn't stay. He turned around within 48 hours and flew back to the airport. And Jenny and I tried repeatedly to retrap him and move him again without success. There was a little bit of fool me twice, shame on me, I think, with this owl. Interestingly, he was right there next to the Schuylkill River, which was full of waterfowl, but he never hunted anywhere on the river. He spent his days along the airport, sitting next to the runways and the taxiways, and then at night would fly out and hunt the intersections and median strips on I-95, hunting for voles and rats and who knows what else was out there. And unfortunately, one morning, just before daybreak, he flew across an active runway as a cargo jet was taking off and was struck and killed. Now, that was a tragedy for him. It was a symbol of how rugged those transmitters are, that even though it broke almost every bone in his body, the transmitter kept working. Um, and fortunately, it did not bring down the plane, because that's the single biggest worry with these bird strikes, is that it's going to damage the aircraft, and pose a risk to the people on it. One of the things that we have done from the beginning with Project Snowstorm is try to figure out better ways to keep airplanes and owls apart. And so, since we started, we have tagged more than 42 snowy owls at 13 airports in the US and Canada. These birds were tagged and relocated away from those airports. And then we looked at the tracking data to see what worked best for keeping these birds away from airports. And we've come up with some best practices that we have shared in peer-reviewed publications through the Journal of Wildlife Management, to give airport managers and the biologists that work at those airports trapping and relocating these birds hints on the best ways to move them. For example, moving the birds, not surprisingly, the farther you move them away from the airport, the better. But also, if you hold the birds for at least 48 hours, feed them, get them frozen lab rats, frozen mice, give them something to eat, and hold them for about 48 hours. That significantly reduces the chances that they're going to be coming back to those airports. But these owls do get in trouble, and we've had from the beginning a terrific team of wildlife veterinarians and pathologists that have donated their times to understanding the the health and toxicology and environmental contaminant landscape that these birds are facing when they come south. And so this was a team that was put together by Dr. Cindy Driscoll there on the left, who at the time was the state wildlife veterinarian for the state of Maryland for their Department of Natural Resources. In the middle is Dr. Cheryl Davidson from the University of Pennsylvania's New Bolton Center at Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. And on the right, Dr. Erica Miller, now of University of Pennsylvania as well, and part of what's known as the Wildlife Futures Program in Pennsylvania that studies emerging wildlife diseases. And at the end of the winter, having coordinated with federal and state and provincial wildlife agencies and wildlife rehabilitators across the US and southern Canada, they gather together all the salvaged snowy owls that folks have been able to find. They necropsy these birds. We now have a data set of more than 400 snowy owls, as I said earlier, that have been necropsied. One of the things we found is that, as I said before, most of these snowy owls coming south in these big eruptions are perfectly healthy. They are not starving to death, but they do run into trouble. They are, especially the young birds, are very naive. They don't know what planes are. They don't know what vehicles are. They get themselves into a lot of trouble. We've also discovered that the contaminant landscape that these birds are flying into and experiencing is dangerous, and in some respects getting more dangerous. One of the things that surprised us is the degree to which these birds are exposed to methylmercury, which is, as I'm sure many of you are aware, an air pollutant that eventually precipitates out into aquatic food chains and bioaccumulates up through the food chain. And if the concentrations get high enough in the bodies of birds, it can cause reproductive problems. It can cause behavioral problems. I mean, the old phrase "mad as a hatter" was because people that made hats in the 19th century using mercury to make felt often went mad. They often suffered severe neurological problems because of mercury contamination. One of the things that concerns us most right now is the degree to which we are finding snowy owls are exposed to anticoagulant rodenticides, to rat poisons. We have seen a really alarming increase in the percentage of snowy owls just in the 13 or 14 years that we've been in operation, that are showing signs of rodenticide poisoning at levels that we consider to be dangerous or lethal, from almost no birds in those early years in 2013, 2014, 2015, to as high as 56% of the birds that we were testing as recently as 2022. Now, we haven't been able to test many snowy owls since 2022 because avian influenza is killing a lot of snowy owls, And if the birds test positive for avian influenza, we can't necropsy them at the New Bolton Center because that is the state's um, poultry lab, and they understandably are reluctant to bring specimens infected with avian influenza into a place where they're doing a lot of work with poultry. So we're flying a little bit blind right now, but it seems really alarming the degree to which snowy owls are being exposed to these contaminants. So if you have an opportunity to use rodenticides, please don't, because this is a problem not just for snowy owls, but for virtually every raptor out there. These birds are being exposed to dangerous levels of rodenticide. These birds start moving north again it varies. The adults move north first. The adult males in particular, they're often out by the middle to the end of March. The adult females a little bit later. The juveniles, they're not really in a particular hurry to go north because they're often not old enough to breed until they're 2, 3, 4 years old. So they're often hanging around until April, sometimes as late as May. But usually by the middle of the end of May, these birds are all moving north. Now, these transmitters, as I said before, communicate with us through the cell phone network. So once these birds move out of the cell network of southern Canada, and it really is a very limited cell network in southern Canada, we lose track of them. To give you a sense of how limited that is, this is the cellular map for southern Ontario. So you can see once these birds move into western, western Quebec, Western Ontario, north of Lake Superior, we lose track of them pretty quickly. But their transmitters continue to store data all through the Arctic summer. And then when these birds come back south again, assuming that they do come back south the next winter, once they get down into cell range, we get this data dump of sometimes tens of thousands of GPS points that show where they've been the previous year. And it's really cool to see where these birds are going. This is just a small sampling of some of the tracks that we've had from individual birds over the years. You put all of this together, and this is what it looks like. Project Snowstorm, as I said earlier, now probably has the world's largest movement data set for snowy owls. And you'll notice, because it's really obvious, that there are some very clear pathways that these birds are tending to fly. Remember, these are open country birds. These are not birds of the forest. And so traversing that boreal forest zone across southern and central Canada is a bit of a trial for these birds. And one of the things you can notice, I'm hoping you can see my cursor moving here, is that some of these birds that tried to go straight across the boreal forest didn't make it. These are young birds on their first migration. We don't know in many cases what happened to them. They disappear into the forest there. It's very remote country. On occasion, we've been able to have people go in and try to track them down, but generally speaking, by the time they find them, there's not much left. So we don't know if they're killed by predators. We're just not sure what happens. But those boreal forests are dangerous places for them, which is why many of these birds, even if they're wintering very far to the east here, will loop far to the west and come up through the prairies so that they're traversing the smallest, shortest degree of boreal forest as they can, or they'll come up through um, Quebec and Ontario and make this beeline for James Bay and then loop around Hudson Bay on either side up into the Agava Peninsula and on up. All of the tracking data that we get from all of these birds is also archived with MoveBank, which is the world's largest archive of wildlife telemetry movement data. Our data are available for other researchers to use. We ask them to contact us first if they're going to use it and not to publish without our permission. But because all of this data has been made possible through donations from the general public, we want to make it as publicly available as possible. But we're also very busily mining this data for peer-reviewed science. At this point, we've published, I want to say, about 12 or 13 peer-reviewed papers on the movement ecology of snowy owls. We've also worked with our colleagues in the International Snowy Owl Working Group, most recently to publish a paper that was lead authored by Dr. Rebecca McCabe at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, that was the first global conservation status and population trend assessment for snowy owls. It took several years of work with our colleagues in Canada, Alaska, Russia, Scandinavia, Europe, who've been working with snowy owls all around the world. One of the things we found is that the snowy owl population is much smaller than was assumed for a long time. At one point, the assumption was that there were about 300,000 snowy owls worldwide. Probably the total number of snowy owls, breeding age adult snowy owls, is between 14,000 and 28,000 snowy owls in an average year. Now, that doesn't mean the population has dropped from 300,000 to a little more than 30,000. What it means was for many, many years, we were grossly overestimating the number of snowy owls because we did not appreciate the fact that they can move thousands of miles from one breeding season to the next. We've had snowy owls that in our group that had nested one year in the Ngava Peninsula, and the next year were nesting up here in the far northwest of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Birds that were breeding in Baffin Island one year may be breeding in Greenland the next year. These birds are moving back and forth. So they were being double, triple, quadruple counted for many, many years. So we know there are far fewer of them than we once thought. But we also know that their population is declining. Becca was able to show that there's been about a 30% decline in snowy owl populations in the last 3 generations of snowy owls, which is about 25 to 30 years. So the population trend for these birds is worrisome. And given the fact that they breed at the very northernmost latitudes in the northern hemisphere, from Alaska to Canada to Greenland to Scandinavia to Russia, they have gone as far north as they can. They really have no place to go farther north as the climate begins to warm. And we have seen climate impacts for these birds in parts of the Arctic already. I want to leave you here with one last track. And this, I said before, sometimes we really have to scratch our heads on some of these. This is one of those birds that spent the winter out on Lake Erie. And that spring, when he flew north, he flew up to Hudson Bay and actually out onto Hudson Bay where he did this. And this puzzled the hell out of us for a number of days, I can tell you, until again, the penny finally dropped and we realized this is the track you get when you have a snowy owl that is riding on an ice floe out in the open water of Hudson Bay. And again, hoping you can see my little cursor here. And what you see is when the tide and the wind are going in the same direction, the owl goes a fairly good distance, and then the tide goes against the wind and the owl comes back, and then the tide and the wind are going in the wind. And then the wind comes out of the south, and then the wind comes out of the southeast, and then the wind's blowing from the west. And then at some point the owl says, "The hell with it," and flies back to land again. If you are interested in following what we're doing on Project Snowstorm, we would love to have you come along for the ride. Take a screenshot of this right now. Go to www.projectsnowstorm.org. I'll be posting. I already posted our first, welcome to the new season blog post because, man, there are snowy owls all over the southern Canada and the northern United States this year. I'll be posting updates probably on about a weekly basis this fall. We also have, again, we are running a crowdfunding campaign. As I said before, every dime that we get goes into the field in terms of technology, either in terms of the transmitters that we're running or into the lab. We also have been increasingly able to fund research analyses. And in fact, partnering with Hawk Mountain this year, we were able to hire a terrific Spanish-born Argentinian postdoc, Diego Galago Garcia, who has just wrapped up doing really cool analysis of all of our summer movement data, looking for patterns. Our holy grail would be to come up with a way to predict where snowy owls are going to be in the future instead of just, sort of passively figuring out where they were in the past from the tracking data. We're not sure we're going to be able to do that, but one of the things that Diego was able to come up with in this analysis was identify a number of areas in the central and eastern Canadian Arctic that snowy owls return to again and again and again over the years. And this is using all of our data. Also, we've had terrific collaboration with our colleagues like Karen Wiebe, formerly at the University of Saskatchewan, who, with her colleagues, has been doing a lot of snowy owl tracking in the Canadian prairies. They made all of their tracking data available to us. We suspect that these areas that Diego has been able to identify are areas of particular conservation importance for snowy owls. And so we're going to be talking to the Canadian Wildlife Service about that. The Canadians just uplisted snowy owls to a higher level of conservation concern because of, in part because of that work that we did showing that snowy owl populations have been dropping globally. So the data that we're collecting, the data that our generous donors make possible every year, is going directly toward conserving these birds. So I'm going to stop talking at this point because I've been talking for a while. I'm going to take a drink of water. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if there are questions that people have in the Q&A, maybe Bill can help me with that. And I'm happy to answer as many of those questions as I can. So hang on just a second here. Bill, you are muted.
How's that? Better
That's
now?
much better. That's much better. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Well, Scott, thank you very much. What an interesting project you and your colleagues are endeavoring.
And,
You're on
and it was
top.
completely accidental. None of us really, we when I have to tell you a quick story. When we started this early on, we had a conversation. We wanted all the data that we were collecting to go into eBird where possible. And there was a conference call with the eBird team, and I couldn't see who asked this question, so I don't know if it was Chris or somebody else at eBird. Um, and they were a little peeved. They said, well, yeah, this is good. We're happy to collaborate with you, but next time, can you bring us into the planning process a little earlier? I said, there was no planning process. We pulled this out of our butts. We literally pulled this together in about 3 weeks. It's it has been a delight and a joy to be doing this. And the folks I've been working with are some of the best folks in the world. So anyway,
Well,
what kind
that's
of
great.
questions do people have for me?
Well, let me reiterate to folks if people don't know that if anybody in our audience has questions, they can type in the question on the Q&A function at the lower part of your screen, and you can answer them that way. We have had a couple come in so far, and one from one of our DFO members is: Do SNOW,
Mhm.
snowy owls,
Yep.
migrate in day or night or both?
We have seen them mostly flying at night. They are during the times of the year when it gets dark, they are primarily active after dark. There have been some times where we've had birds that lingered in the north very late in the season into like late December, early January, and then they've made very rapid flights south that included some daytime flights. But for the most part, they're flying at night, and I have to say they're kind of I hate to use the word lazy, but they're kind of lazy migrants. They tend not to make long, extended flights. They fly for a short time, land, fly for a short time, land. Um, Now they can move long distances. We've had some birds, as I said, that have come south late in the year where they've moved like 700 or 800 kilometers in just a matter of a night or two when they were really pushing it. But for the most part, they're kind of lollygagging, to be quite honest. That's not a
Okay.
character. That's not a character flaw. That's not meant to be a judgmental reflection. It works for them.
Okay. Are you ever going to try tagging owls that do go west?
We have wanted to try to get some tags on birds in the West. We don't currently have any banders that we're working with that have the necessary permits and the necessary training in the West or in the Northwest. And we actually have not had as I'm sure many of you are aware, have not had a big eruption in the West since Project Snowstorm started. We've been waiting kind of year after year to see if there was going to be a big like Pacific Northwestern invasion where they had some in the like late 2000s. There were a couple of years when there were some really big invasions. It just hasn't happened. We'd be very, very curious to see what kind of similarities or differences you'd have with movement patterns out west. So yeah, we'd love to do that. If there are folks on this call that are experienced raptor banders and would be interested in partnering with us, I would love to hear from you kind of offline. It would be nice to have that kind of queued up and ready to go the next time there is a big push out west.
Okay, great. Any signs of problems from aspergillosis in the birds that come south?
Um, so aspergillosis is a fungal infection, a respiratory infection, and it sometimes hits birds, especially those that end up way far south. Folks may recall that big invasion year in 2013, 2014. There were snowy owls as far south as Jacksonville, Florida, and Georgia, and those birds did not fare well because it's warm and humid, and often those are also the birds. These are often juvenile males because they're the smallest and kind of at the bottom of the social and dominance hierarchy. So they tend to get pushed farther south. So they're probably kind of at the ragged edge anyway. The big problem that we're facing right now with snowy owls, the big disease issue is highly pathogenic avian influenza. I mean, this has been just brutal for snowy owls. And we saw this with our tagged birds. We were averaging about anywhere from 9 to 12 of our previously tagged birds coming back every winter. And then when avian influenza hit, that dropped to like three. And
Mm.
we have no doubt that a lot of our previously tagged birds just simply did not survive. Um, and as I said, we've seen many, many, many dead snowy owls that have been collected and tested and positive for HPAI. They're especially if they're feeding on water birds. That's one of the, waterfowl and gulls are among the big reservoirs of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And we keep waiting for this epidemic to burn itself out, and it just hasn't happened. And so, we cross our fingers every year and hope that maybe this winter is going to be better than the last couple have been. And I, I'm not sure what's going to happen. We do know that some snowy owls survive it, that they develop an immunity to it. We've seen that with other birds, but it when you're talking about a global population of fewer than 30,000 individuals, um, a disease like avian influenza could have real population level impacts on this species on top of all the other threats that are facing snowy owls. So that really does worry us. I wish aspergillosis were the only thing I had to worry about with these birds coming south.
Mhm. What's the average lifespan of a snowy owl, and how do you capture them?
So the average lifespan of snowy owl is based on banding data, which is probably not a really good way of assessing it because there's not a lot of band recoveries. Is probably typical for a bubo owl like a great horned owl and snowy owls. So it's probably in the 8 to 12, 13 year range. The record, Norman Smith, whom I mentioned a couple of times in this evening's presentation, holds the longevity record for snowy owl, which I think at this point is 26 years. One of
Wow.
his birds that was banded at Logan Airport as a juvenile, so we know how old it was when he banded it, and it returned, more than a quarter century later. So it's possible for them to live long. In captivity, they can live, 30, 40 years. but that's rare in the wild. As far as trapping them, we're using. You saw a picture of me with a bow net over my shoulder. We can use bow nets more often than not. Banders use what are known as fly traps, which are noose traps. Um, all of these traps are we use we use live lure animals, but these are fully caged live lure animals, so there's no way for the owl to actually hit the animal. Mostly small rodents. We're usually using the lure animal of choice is a Russian hamster because Russian hamsters don't mind the cold. They're super active in the cold. They look like a lemming. And basically, you've got a little cage with the hamster in it, surrounded by, this is kind of hard to describe, a metal ring with large monofilament nooses. So it's like a ring of nooses, and the metal ring is attached to a bungee cord, which is attached to a lightweight drag. Basically, the owl comes in, reaches out, tries to grab um, that hamster that's in the cage. The noose closes on its legs. It slows the owl down, brings the owl down gently. Um, Again, the last thing we want to do is anything that's going to hurt the owl. The folks that we are working with are all highly experienced, highly trained raptor banders. They've been doing this for years and years and years and years and years. Once the owl's in hand, takes 45 minutes to an hour to put the transmitter on. It's a fussy process. We are really, really finicky about how we put the transmitters on. More than once I have gotten a harness on and not been happy with the way it fits and cut the harness off and did the whole thing over again because this owl is essentially going to be carrying this transmitter for life. And we want to make sure that it fits seamlessly and comfortably. And again, you know, the transmitter by regulation, by the terms of our permit, the transmitter, the harness, and the band cannot weigh more than 3% of the bird's body weight. That seems to be a safe threshold for what are known as auxiliary markers, like transmitters. This is a bird that can eat about a third of its weight at a sitting, so I suspect a 30-gram transmitter on the back of a 2,600-gram snowy owl, they probably relatively quickly don't notice it anymore.
Okay. Um, you've indicated how successful you've been in crowdfunding to get your budget for your volunteers and the expenses that go with that. How can people participate in that if they wish to donate to
Just
Project?
go to projectsnowstorm.org. There's a donate button there. And I will be probably right after Thanksgiving, I will be doing my annual here's what we raised, here's what we spent blog post where I will give a penny for penny accounting of how we used the money that we raised last year and what we spent it on.
Okay.
It's been I will say that we have with the HPATH avian influenza epidemic, there was a stretch of time where we were not deploying that many transmitters, and so we were not spending as much money on the tech side. But we've been looking for other ways to use the funds that we've been raising in that will advance conservation and education about snowy owls. And one of the things I'm most excited about is that we're now partnering with some education specialists at Alvernia College in Pennsylvania in developing what will eventually be a pre-K through 12 set of educational curriculum that we're going to be making available free to educators across the U.S. They will be in line with U.S. educational standards. You know, they'll be available for folks in Canada as well, though they may not align quite as well with Canadian education standards. But this is something we've wanted to do for a long time. We already have been making our data available if we've had a bunch of, like, for example, really um, terrific middle school and high school students who've used our tracking data to do some pretty sophisticated science fair analysis. In fact, like prize-winning science fair analysis. If you're an educator and you're interested, if you know, we obviously ask that you don't publish anything using our data, But again, we are very aware of the fact that the only reason we're able to do this is with the help of the public. And so
Mhm.
we want to pay back to the public, and we want to pay back to the owls as much as we can. We're all about using the funds that we've been entrusted with to advance the conservation of this species.
So it's projectstorm.org.
Project Snowstorm, all one
Snowstorm.
word,
Yeah, Project Snowstorm.
projectsnowstorm.org. Yep.
Yeah, great.
And you can just Google us. You'll find us real fast online. So,
Okay. What creatures predate snowy owls, such as when they stray into the boreal forest?
oh, that's a good question, and I wish I had a better answer for that. I suspect, surprisingly enough, that one of them are great horned owls. And you might think, okay, so snowy owls are bigger than great horned owls, and that's true. Although some of those northern great horned owl subspecies are pretty big, and a snowy owl in the forest is in an alien environment where the great horned owl has the advantage. And one of our snowy owls that we tagged last winter, it was a young bird. We because we had lost so many birds during the avian influenza epidemic, we actually deployed some transmitters on juvenile snowy owls last winter, and it was a young bird that started to move north up through the Bruce Peninsula between Lake Huron and the Georgian Bay, and her transmitter stopped moving. And it was frustrating because we could see that her transmitter had stopped moving, but it wasn't sending us much data. And in fact, it was only sending us a single GPS point deep in this very dense forest in a large wildlife management area that was pretty much inaccessible. And bless their hearts, two Canadian Ontario Ministry of the Environment biologists who were doing bear research in the area volunteered to try to find this bird and couldn't because it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Um, just within the last couple of weeks, after the leaves dropped, this transmitter got enough solar power to send us like 400 GPS points. And so Charlotte England and Malcolm Wilson, the two trappers and two banders that had deployed the transmitter on this bird, we were able to average out all of those GPS points, and they loaded those coordinates into a handheld GPS unit and went pretty much right to the spot where they found the remains of this bird. Sadly, there wasn't enough left to tell what had happened. It was just the large bones. It had been scavenged. We don't know, was she killed by a great horned owl? Was she killed by did she end up on the ground? Did a coyote grab her? Did a bobcat? Did a lynx? We just don't know. Um, that's the frustrating part is sometimes these birds disappear, and by the time we're able to get in to see them, we're not able to tell what happened. But we do know that the boreal forest spring migration for these birds really is the danger time. We've lost some experienced adult birds on spring migration where they're passing through that boreal zone. That's the single most dangerous part of their movement once they move away from places like roads and airports.
Mhm. Okay. Would you give more detail on how climate change is affecting the owls in the northernmost latitudes?
Sure.
Maybe not only snowies, but other owl species too.
Sure.
Would you?
Well, there's a couple of issues with snowy owls. And I think the one that worries us the most is that, as I said before, these birds are mostly breeding successfully only in years when lemming and vole populations at one of these cyclical peaks. And generally speaking, those small mammal populations only make these really sharp peaks if they're able to get started breeding in the middle of the winter, which sounds counterintuitive. But, in the Arctic, you've got this, in many places, a really deep, thick, insulating snowpack. And under several feet of snow, even in the middle of an Arctic or subarctic winter, the temperature down near ground level can be close to freezing. And so what often happens is these lemming populations, they'll start to the lemmings will start breeding in the wintertime in this subnivean environment, in this sub-snowpack environment. And so they start building this population momentum, and then when the snow melts, there's lemmings everywhere. And that's when you end up with, these booms like you saw. Well, the problem is, as the climate is changing in the Arctic, in many parts of the Arctic, the winters are getting warmer and wetter. So instead of having this deep, thick, insulating snowpack, you've got much shallower snow. It may melt. You may actually get rain in the middle of the winter that comes down, and you get an ice pack close to the ground. And what has happened in places like the Scandinavian Arctic, where, way back to the 19 teens and 1920s, you've got records of, like, every 4 years, like a metronome, boom, up, down, up, down, peak, boom, peak, bust, peak, bust, peak, bust. And then starting in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that kind of flatlined. Now, the lemmings didn't disappear. They just kind of evened out, and you don't get these big booms. And in those areas, snowy owls have ceased breeding. I think in the last 20 years, there's only been one summer when snowy owls were breeding in the Scandinavian Arctic. And that's had an impact on other Arctic species like Arctic foxes that also depend on those lemmings. Um, that's happened in parts of Greenland, in places like the Russian Far East and Siberia. In the Russian Far East, you've seen not so much a collapse of lemming populations, but a lengthening of the period between peaks. So instead of happening like roughly every 4 years, now it's more like every 6 years or every 8 years. So the snowy owls aren't breeding as often in those areas. Now, ironically, one of the weird things about climate change is that it doesn't make everything get uniformly warm everywhere. In fact, some places, because of climate change, at certain times of the year can get colder. And in the central and eastern Canadian Arctic, late winter and early spring have become colder and snowier than they were. So that means, at least for the moment, at least in those parts of the snowy owl's range, the conditions for lemmings and voles are actually getting better. Now, if you're a Hudsonian godwit that's just flown 9,000 miles from southern South America, and you're arriving at a place like Cape Churchill, and it's still snowy, that's bad for you. And so for long distance migrant shorebirds, for Arctic nesting waterfowl, this has been a problem. But for lemmings and snowy owls, you can argue that in that part of the Canadian Arctic, and this is the area where the snowy owls that are coming into, like, basically the Great Lakes on east, are coming from, and probably some of the snowy owls that are coming down into the Canadian prairies, and even as far south as Colorado. That's where these birds are for the most part breeding. So for the moment, and I don't think anybody should take any long-term comfort from this, conditions for snowy owls and lemmings in those areas may actually be improving. Now, the long-term forecast is that even up there, the climate is going to catch up with these snowy owls. The worry is these owls have gone as far north as they can. They're already breeding at the very northern extremes of land, and they can't breed out in the water. So, they have no place to go from here. So, we are concerned. There's no doubt about it. And that's why I think it's important, especially now that we realize that there are far fewer of them than we thought there were before, to try to minimize as much as we can the threats and risks that these birds face when they come south and share these more southerly landscapes with us.
Okay. Let's see here. Is it possible to get some banding and tagging efforts going outside of North America? I think China and Mongolia been having a few good snowy winters in the last few years. Great talk. Do they occur in China and Mongolia? Snowy,
Um,
snowy owls?
I That's a really good question. I think given
Just don't
the
associate.
unfortunately, the geopolitical situation has made snowy owl research difficult. We still are in communication with our colleagues in Russia, but for example, none of our Russian colleagues were able to attend the last International Snowy Owl Working Group meeting in Minnesota, 2 years ago. Um, There is snowy owl tracking that's going on in other parts of, particularly in Greenland and in years past in Scandinavia. The Norwegians and the Swedes and the Finns have been doing a lot of work. Some folks in Belgium that have been working in Greenland over the years. So there's a strong international component there. I don't see anybody getting tracking and tagging going in China anytime soon. Um, the the international political climate right now would probably make it pretty difficult for an American to say, "Hey, can we come over and start putting these tiny little high-tech tracking devices on birds that are flying through your country?" Um, I I'm not sure how I'm not sure how that would fly, if you'll pardon the pun. So,
Okay. All right. Let's see what else we've got here. To what do you attribute the sharp increase in rodenticide-related contamination among the owls? Is this a function of rat populations exploding in
no,
urban areas? What can we, the public, do besides obviously not using poisons? Help
the
spread the word about this and what options for eradication
right.
are? Yeah.
So the big problem is that anticoagulant rat poisons have become much more powerful, and we as a society are using a lot more of them. These things are really dangerous, and in fact, dangerous enough that the feds barred their use. You can't just, walk into, a Home Depot and buy these really strong second generation anticoagulants. You have to hire a professional, and that's what people do. And the professionals come in, and the very first thing they say is, "Well, let's just put a lot of rat poison out here." That's just it's easy. That's the go-to solution. And but I will say there's work being done on non-anticoagulant um, uh, solutions. Like, for example, cottonseed oil sterilizes mammals that eat too much cottonseed oil, including people. There's been cases where people have tried to use cottonseed oil for their cooking and they've rendered themselves sterile. And there are companies that make cottonseed oil based rodent birth control. And there's a company called Contrapest, and it's liquid. It's a little bit harder to use than just putting rat poison pellets out. But it's non-toxic for animals that eat these um, that eat the animal. It's non-toxic for the predators that eat the rats or the mice that have consumed this stuff, um, because these second generation anticoagulants are not just secondary poisons where an animal that eats the poisoned animal dies, but in some cases tertiary poisons where an animal that eats the animal that ate the poisoned animal can be poisoned. And these things are these compounds are wickedly, wickedly strong. So I would suggest, in addition to not using it yourself, um, talk to your elected representatives. Most states have, like, for example, a state pesticide board. Um, for example, the state of Massachusetts right now the state legislature is considering much more strongly regulating and perhaps even banning the use of second generation anticoagulants in the state of Massachusetts. And so Project Snowstorm just submitted formal comments to the Massachusetts Pesticide Board, supporting any kind of strengthening of regulations, and submitting the data that we have on snowy owls, the degree to which snowy owls are being poisoned by rodenticide. Many of the snowy owls that are in our database have come from Massachusetts, so we've been able to show them directly with the number of birds from Massachusetts, and this really dramatic increase especially the last 7 or 8 years, in the percentage of these birds with dangerous levels of rodenticide in their system. So
Mhm.
so, work your elected representatives. Let them know that this is a problem. And it's not just a problem for snowy owls. This is a problem for every single raptor out there. Whether you're talking about barred owls or great horned owls or red-tailed hawks or kestrels, it's hard to find a raptor that is not being affected by rodenticide poisoning.
Okay. Last question, where can we see your research on sawettes?
Oh, my research on saw wets. That's a good question. I've got some stuff on my website about that. If you go to scottweidensaul.com, um, we've published some things over the years. Unlike Project Snowstorm, where we have all of our publications available on our website that you can download, I have to admit that I don't have a central location for our saw wet research. We just keep plugging along out there in the woods of Pennsylvania. I'm driving, I'm heading up at like daybreak tomorrow morning and driving 7 hours down to Pennsylvania to help tear down our stations at the end of the season. We're wrapping things up with Thanksgiving in the offing. So which means I probably should be going to bed pretty soon too.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah. We're just winding down. But probably for more information about you, if people just Googled Scott Weidensaul
yeah,
and Sawwhet Owls, you'd get some information
yeah,
and more information about you, interviews. You've been interviewed and written up. Um,
yeah.
Scott Weidensaul, just Google your name and lots of information will come up about you.
And some of
So
it will even be accurate.
oh yeah, such is the media, right? I'd
That's right.
like to urge everybody, if you're interested in joining DFO and supporting our efforts and with Raptors and others, but just go to dfobirds.org and you'll have an opportunity to join us. Scott, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. It's
Well,
amazing what technology can do and the work that you've turned up. Some of these things that we thought about
it's been
snowy
it's
owls over the years that they're starving when they come down here and spending
it's
time out in open water and riding icebergs.
it's fun. It's been fun. It's been fun stuff. Hey, this has been so much fun, and I just want to acknowledge I've been looking at the participant list. There's an awful lot of friends and familiar names on there, and I'm really grateful that some folks that I know took time out of their schedule to join DFO, and you folks should become members of DFO um, if they are not so.
And
Um,
vice versa, and vice versa.
and yes,
You know,
so
we're all in this together, and
that's right.
we
That's
should
right.
be cooperating and supporting each other in efforts like you and your
Amen.
colleagues, Noe
Amen.
and
Amen.
Saul, everything else.
Super.
You've
Well,
been great, Scott. Thanks so much.
thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Sorry to keep you up late.
No, that's fine. I knew it was going to be a case. I like talking about snowy owls. This is not hardship.
A,
All right,
a word
everybody.
of a
Good night.
word
Happy
about
This
Thanksgiving
has
to
been
everybody.
yeah,
this
a
has
word
been
about
amazing, and we really appreciate you being with us tonight. It's so informative and
Well,
just tremendous, tremendous, tremendous information. Thank you so much.
thank you very much, Susan. It's been a
oh,
pleasure. All righty.
okay.
Good
Good
night,
night.
everybody.